Thank you all for coming tonight. Thanks for joining us. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome to the Rockefeller Center and to Dartmouth College more generally, John V. Kane. He's an assistant professor at New York University's Center for Global Affairs. He's a scholar of many interests. We actually just had him go to classes, meet with students. He's already given another presentation today, but we're very honored that he continues to join us today for the climax, the pinnacle here. His research interests more generally, you'll get a sense of that from the talk, are political psychology, public opinion, and also research methodologies, including experimental methods. At NYU, he teaches graduate courses on research methods, political psychology, and specifically identities. And he's received many teaching awards, both at NYU as well as the institution where he completed his PhD at Stony Brook University. And that's where I first met John almost, maybe 10 years ago, coming up on it anyway. He was a doctoral student in the Department of Political Science at Stony Brook University. I had the honor of chairing John's dissertation committee, so really this is just a tremendous moment of pride for me as well, to see just how amazing he is. He has gone on to even better things, but it was already quite impressive at Stony Brook University. So we've also published together on occasion in the years since he's taken his degree, mainly on research methods, including a talk he just gave earlier in the government department as well about methodologies for studying politics as well. In addition, with many other co-authors as well as individually, John has published in really the all-star Hall of Fame lineup for a budding political scientist. So American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, the Journal of Experimental Political Science, Political Behavior, and Public Opinion Quarterly. A lot of scholars would go, have their career made just to publish in one or two of those venues. John has published in all of them, and sometimes multiple times. So it's really a tremendous feat. I know these aren't on your local newsstand, but for people in the business, it's quite an accomplishment. Also, you'll notice the talk today on budget deficits is really there's an underlying paper involved in it. So we'll get into the details of that. But he's really known for also clever titles. So, for example, he's got another paper with his co-author Ian Anson about tax compliance, and so it's titled "Ought It Audit?" So he makes little clever plays on words that get you interested in the substantive material for public policy that can sometimes be admittedly sort of dry at times. So the talk today is titled "Do Voters Actually Care About Federal Budget Deficits?" And he's going to go into the details there, talking about partisan biases in this whole process. It's incredibly timely because the United States, as we speak, is, these discussions are in the public debate right now about both deficits in any given year, but then how that accumulates into a debt situation and debt ceiling fights too. So the timing couldn't have really been better, I think, for illuminating the politics surrounding a very important public issue in American politics, and it's appeared across years as well. So this talk will be live streamed as well to our audience beyond the campus here. If you have questions at any point, send them to Rocky Q&A at Dartmouth. That could be an and or an ampersand, Rocky Q&A at Dartmouth, and we'll get those brought in. We're going to have John give a presentation today about maybe 30 minutes or so. Then I'll come back up to the podium with him as well, and we'll ask some questions. I'll get it rolling, and then we'll turn it over for audience. So you'll have plenty of time to ask your questions of John. And with that, I give you John Kane. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. All right, well, everyone, again, thank you so much. Good evening. My name is John Kane. I'm from the Center for Global Affairs, and I'll be talking about some research that I recently did with my colleague Ian Anson at the University of Maryland, where we studied how partisan bias shapes the importance of issues, and on the issue of the budget deficit and the national debt more specifically. So to jump right in, right, we hear, as Jason mentioned, right, we hear a lot right now about a lot of fighting over debt limit and national debt. There's a partisan fight over the debt limit. We hear about the Treasury, right, taking extraordinary measures, right, to try to stave off a default. Certainly concerned about that. We hear that the U.S. is spending record amounts of money. We hear that we are approaching a debt crisis, right? Also that The budget deficit, right, in 2022 exceeded 1.4 trillion, which is a very large number there, and that there's this kind of renewed focus now on fiscal restraint, right? Delay there. And so, whoops, okay, little delay. We're hearing right now frequent political fighting, right? And this is nothing new. For many, many years, we've heard and saw a lot of political fighting about government overspending, right? Which we mean as simply that the government is sort of spending more than it's taking in, right? That's all we mean by government overspending. And it's been happening a long time. This kind of partisan fighting. And that's what inspired our paper, Deficit Attention Disorder, which we published in Political Behavior last year. And so just to be clear what I mean by deficit, I simply mean that annual outlays exceed revenues. The government is spending more than it is taking in any given year. And by debt, it is the sum total of annual deficits plus that pesky little thing called interest. Right? So that is the national debt. So obviously related, but many do sometimes confuse these two terms. Okay. And so we hear a lot of concern about deficits from elites, right? Politicians, people in media, whenever new programs are proposed. So imagine, healthcare. We hear the Affordable Care Act. Medicare for all, policies like this, on the environment, things involving climate change, right? There's a concern oftentimes that we simply can't afford these policies, right? We'll also hear concerns about deficits whenever we hear the Congressional Budget Office projections being invoked by politicians. So the Congressional Budget Office will try to assess, what the impact of passing a particular piece of legislation is on deficits or on the national debt 5 or 10 years down the road, right? So this happens a lot. But we also hear concerns about deficits and deficit spending from both parties during election time as well. So going back to, going back to 2008, so George W. Bush, a Republican, is in office. Barack Obama, a Democratic challenger, right, is running. So this is during the 2008 election, right? He said that George W. Bush's policies have taken us from a projected 5.6 trillion surplus at the end of the Clinton administration to massive deficits and nearly 4 trillion in new debt today. And very famously, during the George W. Bush administration, as the Iraq War is going on and spending is sort of mounting along with tax cuts, so cutting sort of revenues as well, Vice President Dick Cheney famously said that deficits don't matter, right? So here we have Barack Obama, a Democrat, raising this issue. Fast forward a little bit, right, where in 2016 we have a Democratic president in office, Barack Obama, and we now have a Republican challenger, Donald Trump, right, saying that we're a debtor nation, we've got to get rid of the 19 trillion in debt. Right, so we hear it certainly from both parties. But the thing is that when a politician gets into office, and specifically the presidency, it turns out that running deficits is really a bipartisan affair. And so I put together this graph here using data from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. What do we see here? So on the y-axis, the vertical y-axis here, we are looking at the total public debt, so the national debt, as a percentage of the gross domestic product, or GDP, which is really just meaning the size of the total national economy. And so looking at this graph, we can see a few things, right? On the x-axis here is just time, going back from 1973 all the way up until 2020. And what we could see is that the line certainly over time has gone up. That's immediately clear. The blue shaded regions are time periods with Democratic presidents. And so what we can also see is that in general, that line rarely goes sharply downward. It will sometimes tip downward, noticeably in the Clinton administration over here in the 90s, right? Downward slightly, but overall, it tends to remain even or increase sharply, right, in both Republican and Democratic administrations. There are many reasons for that, of course. So economic crises, right, will will tend to result in much greater debt. Wars, military spending, tax cuts, all of these can contribute to the national debt, as well as large-scale crises like COVID. So this graph doesn't even really cover the impact of COVID because it stops at 2020. It pushed the line so that the public debt as a percentage of GDP now exceeds 120, 125%. So COVID has pushed it up even more, right? So there are many reasons for why this line is going up, but admittedly, I'm not an economist, so I can't deeply go into sort of the macroeconomic implications of all this. But as a political scientist, what I can say is that neither party can really easily claim to be, all that committed to reducing debt, right? Neither party can really do that. But of course, right, politics isn't going to let a pesky thing like reality get in the way of a good line of attack, right? So now we have a new Congress, we have a Democrat in office in the presidency, right? And we have a new Congress in the House of Representatives, controlled now by Republicans, and so we see a kind of new emphasis on government overspending, right? And a point that we don't really talk about too much in the paper, but that I think is really useful for thinking about this, is that parties out of power, right, and specifically out of presidential power, they can afford, no pun intended, to be really hawkish on deficits, right? A few reasons for that. Number one, it immediately just makes them appear more responsible, right? So there is something intuitively appealing about the idea that spending more than you have is bad. So if you can accuse the party in power of doing that, right, you automatically seem more responsible. The party in power, the president, right, seems irresponsible for doing that. And for Republicans in particular, this kind of language could really appeal to their more sort of fiscally conservative or libertarian base, right? This language could really even resonate with those folks even more. So for Republicans, it makes extra sense to kind of do this. Number two, it leaves only tough choices for the president's party, right? So we can, to fix the deficit, it's not that hard conceptually, right? You need either more revenues or lower spending. You get more revenues by raising taxes. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but raising taxes is not all that popular, right? It's not a popular move. There is surprising bipartisan support, surprisingly high bipartisan support for raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations, but any broad sort of tax increases, generally unpopular. On the other side of the equation, you could of course cut spending, right? You could cut spending on services and or military, but this is also politically difficult, and people don't really like having their services cut, and there's some stigmas attached with cutting funding for the military as well. And number three, which I think is another interesting point here, is that any negative consequences will likely be blamed upon the president anyway. So if a president were to take it very seriously and make it the mission of the administration to cut deficits and reduce the national debt, right, say by cutting spending to a substantial amount, we'd likely observe in the short term at least an increase in unemployment, right? And who would that be blamed upon? The president's party. Right? So from the perspective of the out party, right, or the party out of power, it makes tremendously good sense to talk about deficits as an issue, right? It's all upsides. If they do nothing, they're irresponsible. If they do something, there'll probably be some negative consequences for the economy that will be blamed upon the president anyway. Right? So politicians might talk about this even though they don't do a ton about it when in office. Right, but what about voters? Do voters actually care about addressing deficit spending as much as we might hear that they do in, say, public opinion polls or something? And so this is the core focus of our paper, is that citizens are susceptible to partisan bias on this issue, and that partisan biases can affect how they think about policy issues in general, and of course, about deficits in particular. So a long line of research in political science has emphasized that some citizens do have, pretty strong, stable issue preferences about the deficit, about debt. They really have strong feelings about what government should and shouldn't do, and it wouldn't really matter, sort of the partisan politics wouldn't really affect them. There are people like that, but they are a minority. For the most people, right, it is not the case that they have these strong sort of preferences. Instead, most people would rely upon partisan instincts, right? A key aspect of partisanship or partisan bias is that it motivates voters to do and say whatever supports one party over the other party. And so it's a key point here. This form of bias is just motivating people to support their party more over the opposing party. Right? And so how can this kind of partisan bias, you might be asking, right, drive policy attitudes and preferences, especially on something like deficits and the national debt? So in the paper, right, we lay out a kind of existing research on this topic and sort of where we think our contribution fits in. And so these are some of the avenues for partisan bias on various policy attitudes here. And so in the first case, right, what partisans can do as a form of exhibiting bias on issues is they could just simply change opinions. So there's nothing stopping them from changing opinions, right? They could change their opinions to be more supportive of their party or against the other party. So an example of this that I really like is a paper by Barber and Pope. You might not be aware of this, but former President Trump occasionally switched positions on things. I don't know if you're aware of inconsistencies in some of his positions. So they just randomly showed people different positions that Trump has taken and found that Republicans, this kind of switching of whatever position Donald Trump took caused people to change their own stances on these issues to be more consistent with President Trump. Right, so if you oppose a policy or something and then your party comes into power and supports the policy, then you could say, well, actually, I think it's a good idea that we do that. Yeah, it's a good idea. You could just easily switch. That doesn't work out all that well on deficits, though. It's hard to take a pro-deficits position. It just doesn't happen. So you can't really do it on an issue like that. So you might need to turn to some other avenue. Another one open to you is that you could interpret reality differently. You could just simply deny reality or interpret it in a different way to, again, support your party or oppose the other party. So Kinder and Calmo, in their book, they talk about how during the 1990s, Clinton administration, the Democratic administration, in one of the rare moments in U.S. history where the government was actually running surpluses, I know it's crazy to imagine, but they're running government surpluses, Republicans were far more likely than Democrats to say that the government was still running deficits, even when it was actually running surpluses, right? So just that kind of like reality not registering part. Or, right, just different interpretations. So Gaines et al. Have a paper about the Bush administration during the Iraq War as it's going on, looking at Democrats and Republicans, and they'd ask people sort of once weapons of mass destruction, if you remember that, right? Once they weren't found, they were asking people sort of why they think that is. Democrats were overwhelmingly likely to interpret the failure to find WMDs as evidence that they never existed in the first place, right? Which, of course, would make the Bush administration look very bad, complicit, and wrong on that policy. Whereas Republicans, on the other hand, were far more likely to interpret this to mean that it's simply because WMDs, they were hidden or moved by someone else, and that it was just a matter of time before they're found. Right, which is far more consistent with what the Bush administration was saying. Right, so if something is happening and your party is in power and it's making your party look bad, you could interpret conditions in a different way so that you could eventually arrive at the idea that, well, actually, it's not going that bad, right? Just looking at it a different way and interpreting facts differently. Again, it's hard to do this on deficits, though. As we saw in the graph, it's kind of always going upward. It's hard to interpret it in a different way, so you may need to resort to another form of bias. That is attributing credit or blame differently. So this is a really good one, too. Partisans can change how they attribute credit or blame to support their party. So Rudolph has a paper looking during the 1990s with Democrats, finding that the more Democrats thought the economy was doing well, the more likely they were to attribute credit for that to the policies of the Clinton administration, right? So for COVID responsibility, right, during 2020, as COVID is ravaging the United States, right, Democrats were far more likely than Republicans to blame the national government and the Trump administration for failures on COVID and for the spread of COVID in general, whereas Republicans were far more likely to blame other governments and other countries for the spread of COVID, right, during a Republican administration. So if you are supportive of the Donald Trump administration, for example, and something is going on that makes it, that just is a kind of bad look for the party, right? You can instead say, well, actually, it is bad, but it's not his fault. It's someone else's fault, right? You could simply blame someone else. This, again, is a little bit tricky on deficits, though, because deficits are clearly related to what the federal government does, right? It's literally about the federal government's behavior, and the president sits at the helm of the federal government. So it's hard to maybe blame someone else for this type of thing. So that leaves open this last kind of avenue, which is the main contribution that we offer in this paper, which is that when all else kind of fails or isn't working that well, you can simply shift the importance of an issue, right? So partisans can change how important they think an issue is to support their party or oppose the other party. This draws a little bit upon some social psychology research on this concept of trivialization. And so to trivialize something means that you regard it as less important as a means of kind of alleviating some negative emotions you're feeling. We've all seen this, maybe even we've all done it. Let's say I'm vying for an award that I'm really hoping to get, and I don't get the award. Maybe I start to say something like, well, you know what, I didn't really want that award anyway. It's a stupid award. Who cares about that award? Right? What am I doing? I'm trivializing the importance of the award, right, to kind of help repair my bruised ego, right? And so we think that that same kind of logic carries over to how partisans would behave on the issue of deficit spending, right? So if you can't easily change your opinion, you can't easily interpret reality differently, you can't easily attribute blame elsewhere, right, then what's open to you is that you could change the importance, right? You could conclude, right, actually, it's not a big deal, right? Deficits don't matter. So this brings us to the main hypothesis of the paper, sort of the key thing that we're going to try to test, which is that partisans are going to adjust the importance of deficit spending based upon the party of the incumbent president, based upon the sitting presidency, or whichever party occupies the presidency. And why do we think this? There. Okay, so our argument here is that partisans face really strong pressures to change the perceived importance of a given issue. For one, the key idea here is that deficit spending is a political liability for the party in power, right? It's just a bad look. It does not make the sitting party look very good when this is happening, right? So there's this kind of pressure to do something because it's not making your party look very good. So what partisans can do in response is adjust how important this is to satisfy that kind of instinct to keep supporting your party or keep opposing the other party, right? So when your party's in power, if something is making your party look bad, what you can do is shift the importance of that downward, right? You can shift it downward to maintain a positive image of your own party, right? But when your party is not in power and the other party is in power and something is going on that makes that party look bad, well, then you can elevate the importance of that issue, right? You can highlight it even more to really maintain that negative image of the opposing party, right? And so that's sort of the background argument and hypothesis that we're interested in testing here, right? But this is all just an idea. Maybe you find it persuasive. We certainly found it persuasive, and we think it makes sense, but as social scientists know, right, lots of stuff makes sense. At the end of the day, you actually have to test it with some real-world data to see if there's any merit to it, right? So in test number one, we look at some survey data. This is from the Democracy Fund. It's publicly available data. It's panel data, which means that we have the same individuals surveyed at multiple points in time, which is very crucial. We have it from the 2016 to 2019 period, in other words, from the Obama administration to Trump administration, which is absolutely key. Right, so fairly large sample size here, about 20,000. The outcome measure is whether a person in the sample identifies the budget deficit issue as being very important or something less, right? Just not very important or not caring at all, whatever it might be. So this is measured in late 2016, the Obama administration, mid-2017, so fairly early in the Trump administration, and then early 2019, which is fairly late in the Trump administration. Okay, and the analysis, for those who are interested in the statistical model underlying this, it is logistic multiple regression, where we're modeling the probability that someone will say that the deficit issue is very important. That's being modeled as a function of an interaction between the year, right, Obama administration or Trump administration, right, and the party of the respondent. Am I Democrat, Independent, or Republican? With standard errors clustered by respondent, because you're observing the same respondent multiple times. Again, just if you're interested in the stats, just wanted to put that out there. You know, if you're okay with going in the weeds for a second, but to back up, right, the key thing that we're looking at here and checking to see is this. Does the likelihood that a partisan believes deficit spending is a very important issue, right? Does that change when we go from the Obama, a Democrat, to Trump, a Republican administration, right? That's the key test here. And so let's see what happens. Okay, so on here, right, is the y-axis here, this vertical axis, and what this is telling us is how much going from the Obama administration to Trump administration, how much that changes the probability that a given respondent would indicate that the budget deficit is very important, okay? And on the x-axis here, we just have analyses for these separate groups, so Democrats, Independents, Republicans. So let's take a look at this first result here. So in the blue arrow here, we see Democrats. What does this mean? This means that when we go from the Obama administration to pretty early in the Trump administration, right, first several months of the Trump administration, we see very little change among Democrats, right? The effect here is right around that zero line, not much change among Democrats. On the Republican side, we see a little bit dip below that zero line, indicating that they now regard deficits as being a little bit less important, which it fits with what we argue, but in fairness, right, independents did the same thing, and we don't think that independents are all that motivated by kind of bias. So what happened to Republicans is about the same as what happened to independents, so I wouldn't necessarily make too much of this, right? However, if we fast forward to, you know, again, this was early in the Trump administration, let's fast forward a little bit to later in the Trump administration. And when we do that, these are just like chef kiss results for our study here. In this case, right, we observe over here for Democrats, when we go from the Obama administration to later in the Trump administration, Democrats have now increased their probability of identifying the budget deficit as being very important, has now increased by 12 percentage points. And on the Republican side, it's the mirror opposite result. So among Republicans there, we see that going from Obama in office to Trump in office, Republicans have now decreased how likely they are to say the budget deficit is very important by 12 percentage points, right? So the key takeaway here being, right, when we went from a Democratic administration to a Republican administration, right, Democrats cared more about the deficit and Republicans cared less about the deficit, right, which is exactly in line with our hypothesis. Notably, too, the deficit is actually getting worse through this whole period. So you could have expected everybody just to say that it's more important, right? Not so. Right? In this case, right, the partisans are polarizing, whereas independents don't change very much at all, which is exactly what we'd expect because they're not so partisan biased. Right? Now, you could look at a result like this. We think this is fairly good evidence for our hypothesis, but you could look at a result like this and say, well, there's a lot going on in these several years. People are exposed to a lot of different information. Maybe it's just different information that partisans are working off of. How do you know that it's really it's just a natural kind of bias to do this versus something else, right? And so that's a good question. To really get at whether it's a natural bias going on, we had to turn to a kind of more controlled way of studying this. So to do that, it brings us to test number 2, in which we use some survey experiments. For survey experiments, right, we did first Amazon.com's Mechanical Turk, which has a little over 1,000 respondents, and then some Lucid data, so using Lucid to field a study, and that had a little over 5,000 respondents. The Lucid data is much more nationally representative in terms of geography, race, gender, age. So I'll report those results, but they're remarkably similar to the MTurk results if you're interested. Now, If I could wave a magic wand as a researcher and set up my ideal experiment, what I would love to do is be able to randomly change whether there's a Democrat in the White House or Republican in the White House. If I could do that, that would be terrific, because then I could see when I change who is in the White House, do I see partisans changing how much they care about the deficit, right? That would be perfect. Obviously, I don't have that magic wand, so I can't do that. So what can I do instead? Our approach was we can use fictitious news articles that highlight one party's president's responsibilities for deficit spending. So what we did was we gave people sort of fake news articles talking about how much the deficit is increased with mostly factual information. But all we changed was whether we talked about Democratic presidents' culpability for that increase in debt or Republicans' culpability for that increase in debt. The statistics, everything else is identical. We are literally just changing Democrat or Republican. All the other information is the same. Then we measured a series of outcomes. We asked 6 items, so a kind of comprehensive way at trying to get at how important people think deficit spending is, how important it is to pass legislation that could address the deficit, right? We combined all of these 6 items onto a 0 to 1 scale. So higher values on this scale mean people regard it as a more important issue. So what were the results? So on here, on the y-axis here, the vertical axis here, this is indicating that scale that I just mentioned. So how important people think the deficit is, right, as an issue. Here on the x-axis, we have in-party presidents and out-party presidents for this purple set of bars. What that means is in-party presidents refers to people in our experiment who read about presidents that were the same party as them. So it's Democrats who read about Democratic presidents' culpability for the deficits, or Republicans reading about Republican presidents' culpability for the deficits. Out party is the opposite. So out party is you have Democrats reading about Republicans' culpability for the deficits and Republicans reading about Democratic presidents' culpability for the deficits. And so what do we see? We see that when we go from reading about your own party's responsibility for the debt to reading about the other party's responsibility for the debt, there's a significant increase in how important people think this deficit was. Right? And so this increase is pretty much on the order of about 7 percentage points or so. And you might be thinking that, okay, in-party, out-party, but maybe did Democrats respond more or less than Republicans? Were there differences here? On one hand, you could theoretically think that Republicans, right, are at least ostensibly the party of kind of fiscal conservatism, right, and maybe voters care much more about that. They wouldn't care so much, which party is doing it. They would regard it as, roughly equally important, which would mean that Republicans shouldn't really show the same magnitude of effects that Democrats showed. Not so. The results are pretty much identical for Democrats and Republicans, so there's no difference between those two. The last little point here is that looking at independents again as kind of a benchmark here, independents, it didn't matter if we showed them Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, it didn't matter at all. They did not change in their sort of perceptions of the importance of deficit spending. And so they didn't change much at all, which is again yet another piece of evidence that it's about partisan bias, right? Independents are not biased in a partisan way by definition of being an independent. And so this manipulation meant nothing to them, but it does mean a lot to partisans. And so as a last kind of piece of evidence here that this is really about partisan bias, we dug into the data a bit deeper, and we looked at the strength of attachment to people's parties. And so the idea here was, the more strongly you identify as a Democrat, say, or as a Republican, the more biased you should be. And in the context of our experiment, what that means is the more biased you are, the stronger the experimental effects should be, right? Because that's what we think is driving this whole thing is partisan bias. Right? So the effect should be even stronger for those who are more biased. In other words, they should be even stronger for stronger partisans. And that is exactly what we see. Right, so among those who kind of only lean toward their party, they don't even really identify with the party, they just kind of lean Democrat or lean Republican, going from reading about their own party to the other party, right, results in a fairly small change in perceived importance of addressing deficits, right, maybe 4 percentage points or so. But if you look over to those who strongly identify with the party, the effect more than doubles to 9 percentage points, right? So stronger partisans are reacting even more strongly to this particular treatment, right? Just as we would predict, right? So the takeaway here being that this serves as evidence, pretty strong evidence, that it really is about partisan bias driving differential attention to deficits and differential importance placed upon deficit spending. Okay. So in conclusion here, right, citizens, we find here in this paper, citizens' perceived importance of deficits. They have a clear partisan component that doesn't really get talked about a ton. Certainly there is potentially a real component, some real concern among some of the public, but as I said, much of the public operates in a kind of partisan fashion. And so we can observe big swings in perceived importance among voters based on which party is in the White House, right? And again, the effects were kind of similar between Democrats and Republicans, despite Republicans having ostensibly more concern for fiscal responsibility. Second, I didn't talk about it too much in this particular paper, in this particular talk, but in the paper itself, we also look at partisan media and how partisan media might also show the same kind of bias about being concerned about deficits. So specifically what we did, we text analyzed about 4,500 transcripts from the Sean Hannity show on Fox and the Rachel Maddow show on MSNBC. And we looked to see if sort of they are showing this same kind of bias when the party in the White House changes. Do we see differential attention to deficits as an issue? And we don't find much on the Rachel Maddow side. It didn't sort of fit our expectation there. But on the Sean Hannity side, this one's about as clear as we could have possibly hoped for. So, during the Obama administration, nearly 40% of Sean Hannity transcripts are talking about the deficit with an explicit attribution to it basically being the president's fault, right? In this case, Obama, right? So it's an issue, the president is responsible for it, we have to do something, right? All of that. When we change from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, that concern all but disappears, right? It almost drops to absolutely nothing in the Trump administration, right? So again, a clear evidence that not only are partisans in the mass public doing this, but also partisans in the media landscape that partisans are exposed to, right? They're also engaging in this sort of partisan-motivated issue attention. So what does this mean for policymakers? For policymakers, I think it makes it tricky, right, and difficult to know when to take deficits seriously, if at all, right? If there's this big partisan component to it, how do we know when, public concern about deficits is really reflecting genuine concern or just sort of partisan posturing, right? Are voters really so concerned about this that they would be willing to make those hard trade-offs, maybe suffer some of the consequences in an effort to get the debt to go down, right? Would they accept tax cuts? Would they accept cuts to spending? Would they accept cuts to military, right? Or, would they accept tax increases? They'll usually accept tax cuts. But tax increases, right? Would they accept that as a means of redressing the deficit? And so one of my favorite headlines, this is going back to the Obama administration when there were similar fights over the deficit and debt ceiling and everything. An NPR article, right? Poll, Americans want deficit cut, oppose fixes. Yeah, this is hard, hard to deal with, right? People want it cut, but the actual fixes that they're willing to bear are, there's much less support for many of those and much more disagreement about those, right? So again, it just makes it hard for policymakers to know when are we at a point where we should really risk, our political futures on trying to fix the deficit. And so the future of deficits as an issue, right, again, there's no easy fix. Tax increases, spending cuts, No one likes either of these. You add to that the macroeconomic implications, maybe short-term increases in unemployment, other things that people don't generally want, but it makes it a very hard issue to fix. Throw onto that a substantial dose of partisan bias, right? And this leads me to basically conclude that deficits as an issue will remain a perpetual source of political ammunition against the president's party by the party out of power well into the foreseeable future. That is assuming that we don't default on the debt, which would be really, really, really bad. So fingers crossed on that one. And thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you for a great presentation, and I want to just give a shout out to the audience at home. We've already got questions coming in, and some very good ones that actually that reinforce this. So I'm going to invert things a bit and go to a question that I had, and also a question from the audience, just to learn more about this, and then we'll pick it up and we'll open it up for the rest of the audience as well. But we got a question. It's right toward the end of your remarks. You talked about what would happen if there was a default on the debt. And so again, just recognizing that we've got this issue between deficits in any given fiscal year, and that accumulates, adding up to the national debt plus the interest, as you illuminated. So one question that we had is, aren't voters crazy not to demand a balanced budget and to demand that the government not raise the debt ceiling? So we this goes to this issue of why don't voters care more about this whole topic?
So aren't they crazy to not demand a balanced budget?
The question is the government, why don't they demand that the government not raise the debt ceiling? So basically hold the line.
Yeah. So I mean that would certainly be the issue of default. So if they're demanding that the government sort of hold the line and not raise the debt ceiling at all, then the U.S. then goes into kind of default mode, which would potentially spook the international economy. Again, I'm not an economist, but the fear there is that now people will lose faith in the dollar, just like you would lose faith in anyone that you loan money to that doesn't pay you back. You'd begin to lose faith in them and not necessarily want to lend to them anymore. And so, that seems to be the reason that the government would need to raise the debt ceiling, and by trying to force the government to, hold the line or keep it where it is, again, there's not really an easy upside to that one. If the concern is fixing the debt problem, lowering deficits, that's something that will take probably many years, and changing what happens to the debt ceiling now can be done separately from that longer term issue.
There's not many countries that actually have this issue, right? Where I think maybe Denmark might be the only other one that has you can't exceed a particular amount. So we're kind of unique in that regard. The first part of the viewer's question, though, is about why are voters demanding a balanced budget? And that's interesting too when you think about the American states. Most of them do operate on this sort of balanced budget kind of idea. So this is the disjuncture in the federalism system between what the federal government is doing and the state government. And we've talked about this too, that people in their own lives, the household budget analogy, right? If you're spending more. If you're spending more than you're sort of taking in, that sort of at some intuitive level feels a little bit wrong. So I think that's in the background motivating this viewer's questions. And the applicability of this. I've done a little bit of research on analogies in a different topic in the health policy domain, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the appropriateness of that sort of model, thinking about the household budget analogy. Yeah.
So again, I think any polls I've looked at, support for a balanced budget is fairly high in the public. I, just as a public opinion researcher, would push back a little bit on that and just try to emphasize the point that yes, ideally, it's very easy to say we want a balanced budget. The hard part is, okay, so how should we do it? And then now is where we start to see the disagreement. So there is remarkably high support for balanced budgets. And also, I think it's one of the most proposed amendments to the US Constitution is a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. So it's a popular idea, but ultimately fails when we start getting into details about how it would happen. On the question of the analogy, yes. So again, not an economist, but I mean the first distinction to be aware of about where that analogy between the household and the country falls apart is, if a single household does not affect what goes on, what goes on and carries through to the entire economy. Right, so if you can't pay a bill or run into debt in your household, that is not going to affect people on the other side of the country. But if the government all of a sudden decides to institute a balanced budget, that will affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people, and no individual household can do that. So that's the first point I would make. The second is that, as a point we talked about a little bit earlier today, that even that household analogy kind of falls apart because there's this thing called a mortgage. And so many people have a mortgage on their home that is far in excess of their annual income, right? So people, if you were to think of like debt as a percentage of GDP, right? So debt as a percentage of annual income, I'm sure many, many, many people, myself included, are way over 100%. You owe way more on that household than you do have coming in terms of annual income. So I think even when you apply it to the household analogy, flawed as that is, it's actually not true. So, if people weren't allowed to take out student loans or mortgages on their home, right? That would be very, very, very bad, right?
It sort of requires thinking about these different domains, the applicability of these different models that we have, either the state or what the national government is doing. I want to come back to this point that you just mentioned about, and it relates, I think, possibly to your research too. You're doing this at a time when the ratio to the GDP, so how much the debt is relative to the entire size of the U.S. economy, it is just in the last 10 years gone sort of above 100%. The last time we were at that was close to World War II, right? So we were borrowing almost as much as the country was sort of producing in any given year. Went down for decades and decades, but again, about 10 years ago, it's sort of gone beyond. So we're sort of at a time where if this is a concern, it would be most evident now. And so I didn't know if you, that in general, but also whether or not we always have to do these studies at any given moment in time. You talked about you can't randomly assign presidents. In this particular case, you're studying this at a time when this debt to GDP ratio is very high. And so I didn't know if that sets the stage for especially strong findings, which I thought those findings were really strong. But I was just wondering if you thought that this would generalize across time and how that affects things.
Yeah, if anything, I mean, as a researcher, I would think that that would make it harder to find significant effects, right? So like, the more that people are genuinely concerned, because it really is high at historically high levels, especially since the 1970s, that would just make it harder to see this sort of partisan bias at work. So I would think that would actually bias results against us for finding anything. So the fact that we still find these pretty large results, despite the deficits being large and the national debt being high, I think is noteworthy. And yeah, I mean, I want to emphasize though that, again, not an economist, but several things, we can't pretend several things didn't happen over the past 10 or 15 years. The Great Recession, historical, right, and just shot, if you saw in the Obama administration, right, just shot the national debt upward, right? People lose their jobs, they can't pay taxes, so revenues are going down. They need more assistance from the government, so spending is going up. That's just a recipe for larger and larger deficits. The second, this little thing called coronavirus, right? That just enormous, enormous impact in terms of 10, 15 percentage points added on to that figure. So just those two things alone can account for so much of why it has kind of skyrocketed. much more so than, you know, any particular like liberal or progressive policy or something like that. And if you factor in then also tax cuts, so during the Trump administration, notably, tax cuts were passed, but no spending cuts, again, going to contribute to deficits.
And that, I want to ask another question. It was inspired by an audience member from the live stream audience, but I had a similar one here. So the question is why do voters not care? How do we convince politicians to do the right thing? And this was in part, you know, I'm wondering if pointing out this inconsistency that you're showing, that you only care about these budget deficits when the other team is in office,
Yeah.
if that information could be, you know, wow, you know, yes, you caught me, you know, so it goes to this viewer's question about, you know, it's almost the hypocrisy in some ways between, you know, the gotcha game on the budget deficit only when your team is not in office.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could speak to that. Is it possible to take what you've learned and to repackage it and sort of improve the state of American politics?
That would be quite an ambitious goal. I mean, I would say to your point, and certainly studies have tried to do this sometimes, where you make people aware of their biases as a form of like educating them, right? So you show them that, you know, probably some of what you think is biased, and it's not just you. Partisans all over do this type of thing, as a way of kind of encouraging them to take this more seriously. I could imagine having that type of discussion. You know, my ideal world would be, okay, could we all just admit that a lot of what we're doing is posturing and is biased? Okay. Now let's bring the heat down a little bit and actually talk about, you know, some common ground ways in which we can start repairing deficits. There are some easy ones like the Social Security, like cap on, you know, income for paying into Social Security, right? There's a cap. Like, there's fairly large bipartisan support for raising that cap. And so, yeah, the Washington Post had a really cool study a couple of years ago where they let people basically play with the budget and figure out, you know, where could we cut, where could we increase taxes. And it turns out that people generally don't like cuts very much, but there's a lot of areas in which voters are willing to raise taxes in particular ways. For example, on high-income individuals or corporations, that would start to repair the deficit and bring it down and lower the national debt, hopefully. Yeah.
Great. Well, we have questions continuing to come in, and I encourage the audience at home to continue to submit your questions to rockyqa@dartmouth.edu. But in the interest of time, I wanted to open up the floor to the audience and hear what our live audience has to say. We have a microphone that will be passed to people who raise their hand. I think we have a question there.
I have a question. How would regular person feel high budget deficits? So what happens in their life when deficit budget is too high?
So how would a normal person sort of feel that?
Yeah.
I think
not business executive, not politics, but just regular people.
Yeah.
What happens in their life when deficit is raising too high?
Yeah, so I think that is such an important question. I think about that all the time. The answer is nothing. Actually, it's that they'll feel even better. So like, imagine I give you a credit card to buy whatever you need for the next year. You'll be running deficits, right? But like, you will be living very well for a year, right? And so you will not be feeling any pain. There is no immediate pain of the government running deficits. One downside would be a slow uptick in kind of how much of the federal budget is being spent on interest, but I mean, the average person is not feeling any of this. You are on the receiving side of the equation. And so in contrast, I think when you start to correct budget deficits, that's when you feel it, right? When I take the credit card away and I hand you a bill, right, for how much you owe, that's when you feel it, right? You don't feel anything when the deficit is going on, which is to the point I raised that it's not an easy fix. And in the short term, the easiest thing to do is to just kind of kick the can down the road a little bit, because changing something will bring on some pain. Hence why, you know, again, with the Republican sort of Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it's no accident that involved tax cuts but no cuts in spending to actually repair the deficit, because repairing the deficit is felt. Not repairing the deficit, certainly, you know, it adds to the debt clock and all that stuff, but beyond that, you don't feel it. And I think that's an important point. Yeah.
We have another question here, and I should have said this initially. Students in the audience, we would love to hear your questions. So here's your
Yeah, thank you so much for coming up to Dartmouth. Really appreciate it. During the first Bush administration, the president was willing to sacrifice his reelection, whole read my lips promise for a balanced budget. It was viewed as an existential crisis.
Yeah.
What are the dangers of continuing to allow the debt to balloon, and why? And what would a balanced budget do to our economy, both per person, per citizen perspective, and what would be the perspective in terms of the global economy?
Wow, yeah, so terrific questions. I'll again emphasize I am a political scientist, not an economist, so there's only so deep I can go into that before I start worrying about upsetting a lot of economists. But your point is well taken about the Bush administration. You know, the consequences of trying to get us to you know, a net zero kind of budget would be immediately felt. So I mean, part of the national economy is government spending. So I mean, it corrected quickly, you'd immediately observe a contraction in the size of the economy, right? It would just immediately contract, and that is felt by many people. So unemployment would begin to go up, right? Defaulting on debts, right, among households, students who can't pay bills anymore, people who have to default on their mortgages, right? With a contraction in the economy, that carries down and filters down to many people's everyday lives. Of course, then what it does, you know, for the U.S. abroad, right? It creates complications, right? Investment in the U.S., for example, if the economy is contracting, you know, what that does for foreign investment and this sort of thing, right? Probably many negative consequences in the short term, which again is just, it's not rocket science. This is why when in office, parties don't generally want to do anything huge about this issue. So I mean, I think the best we could maybe hope for, if we want to take it seriously, because it is at historically very, very high levels. So if we want to take it seriously in some way, these would probably need to be incremental changes that are perhaps you know, delayed somewhat, right? Like and take place in a kind of staggered way to make it adjustable for people and predictable for people to live their lives. Simply just, you know, taking an axe and cutting 20% of the budget to get it to equal will have just enormous ramifications for everyday people's lives. And I don't think any politician really wants to stake their political fortunes, or any party wants to stake their political fortunes on doing something like that.
We talked about how these decisions, you know, are today. You know, you enjoy what the spending is now, but then the consequences are off in the future, oftentimes. And we had a question from the audience, and it related to something else I was wondering about as well. So the question is has your research shown a decrease in the influence of political bias during times of calamity, economic crisis, COVID, that sort of thing? I think your study was fairly in probably the late 2010s up until COVID. I don't believe you have a COVID study in there, or am I mistaken on that?
No, I don't think, most of the data did not.
So you said Obama to Trump, and then probably some survey experiments during Trump. So, by the way, this is an impressive collection of evidence. You don't usually see articles, you know, present an array of evidence like this, the observational studies, the existing survey data, he has the panels, the multiple survey experiments, and then that textual analysis. So chef kissing moment again to you on that.
Thank you.
So the question is, you know, I think motivated by this, you know, can we just come together as Americans, you know, when our backs against the wall and try to, you know, maybe to tamp down the political bias and go after it? Another way of asking that same question is are there some times when deficits are worth it? You know, the whole Keynesian, you know, sort of principle here.
Absolutely.
Especially if it's going to save money overall. So this was an allegation, I think, in COVID. The stimulus response was reacting to the to the Great Recession
Yeah.
response, perhaps not being enough. So some part of this might relate to like when we go into deficits and then more debt and when we don't, and then also what that has for your research if it's occurring at particular moments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that graph, that first graph that I showed, that was part of the idea that reasons that it's going up have a lot to do with what's going on in the economy. You can't easily separate that. I would often, in hearing about like fiscal conservatism and stuff, I just try to do a thought experiment of imagine back during the beginning of the Great Recession, right? And the Bush administration is at the podium addressing the nation about the stock market is crashing and everything is going down. Just imagine the Bush administration saying something like, I know stuff is bad, but we're committed to a balanced budget, and so sorry, we really can't help you on this one. We see revenues going way down because people aren't able to pay their taxes. They're not buying as much, and so we gotta keep that balanced budget going, right? Just imagine what the response would be to that, right? Just not going to happen, right? So the government is running deficits, classical, Keynesian economics idea, running deficits to counter that kind of downward spiral that if you leave the market to its own, it will just downward spiral until it hits some calamitous bottom that no one wants to experience, right? So the government can step in, run deficits to prevent it from ever happening and allow it to hopefully eventually bounce back, right? So there are reasons for those deficits. It's often, I think, framed as just wanton irresponsibility, but I think a point that doesn't come through in the paper so much, but it's just that there are good reasons for this very often.
We have another question from our student right here.
Hi, thanks for being here. So we've seen bipartisan proposals in the past to be able to fix the deficit. I remember like the Simpson-Bowles or Bowles-Simpson Commission back in the early 2010s. Series of compromises like increasing the Social Security age by a little bit, increasing payroll taxes. Of course, that went nowhere. Other proposals have gone nowhere. And even recently, I remember an interesting moment at the State of the Union was when President Biden and the congressional Republicans came together, had this sort of kumbaya moment and said, we're not going to touch entitlements, when of course entitlements have been one of the reasons for some of the persistent deficits that we've been seeing, and not just like the one-off things like during the Great Recession or during the COVID response. So I guess my question is, so instead of like assigning maybe different levels of importance to this issue depending on which party's in the White House, do you think maybe instead parties just like don't care about this issue at all and only like to think about it as like keeping this issue in the public discourse whenever they're out of office?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, if you imagine a kind of continuum, at one end it's political ammunition. At the other end, deficits are a real issue that have to be dealt with. It's really hard to say. I want to think that most level-headed policymakers would know that this is something that has to be addressed at some point. It is a real thing. It can't continue sort of indefinitely. Right now, there were major shocks that brought that debt up, but right now there's no clear path to seeing it come back down to pre-Great Recession levels, and so we don't know how we're going to get there. So I mean, among policymakers, I would say that it is my guess would be, and again, I can't sort of get in their minds, but my guess would be they realize this is a serious thing. The challenge is that the solutions are harder than the status quo. And so that the fixes to it are so challenging and will receive so much pushback that it's just easier to kind of push it down a little bit and hope that some solution magically arises, would be my concern. But again, I think that there is hope eventually if parties can admit that there is something real here, something needs to be done, and if we come to a solution that both parties are kind of dissatisfied with, that might be the right way to go then. As long as there's a little bit of just disappointment on both sides, then maybe we've hit something that can actually work. The problem is when one party thinks it's a total win, right, and then the other party thinks it's a total loss. will get nowhere, right? So it's just raising taxes on corporations, although, yeah, again, that has bipartisan support, but just some avenues for fixes that would be interpreted as one-sided wins. Just they're not going to go anywhere. But I do like your example too in the 2010s. I have a feeling that given recent events, right, those sorts of discussions might come back in the not too distant future.
Well, those were some great questions. We are out of time, unfortunately, but I encourage you to continue to read John Kane's work. Go on his website, download these papers. They're really important. They're really well done. And as you ended, with so many of these solutions are really big, really serious problems. It's going to take the whole country pulling together to try to make some of these things happen. So I encourage you to continue to think of politically expedient solutions to these challenging problems. So
yeah, if they weren't hard, we wouldn't hear about them.
Yeah,
that's basically it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you.